I'll just recap briefly about what I said in the previous two sessions before we go on to the questions themselves. Just to remind you, the key date is 1834, the passing of the Poor Law Amendment Act, which very drastically altered, I mean, in effect, replaced the system which had been in operation since 1601. And it replaced the individual townships as the poor law authorities with the system of poor law unions, of which there were over 30 eventually in Lancashire and well over 600 in the country as a whole. So these were amalgamations of parishes and townships to form bigger units. And one requirement of that was that at the centre or geographical focus of each of the unions, there should be constructed a very large or a very substantial poor law union workhouse, so that people who were absolutely desperate for assistance could go to the workhouse, but it was to act as a deterrent. It was to have strict regimes of behavior and diet. There were to be uniforms rather than your own clothes. And very importantly, and you may remember, we saw some plans that showed this, very importantly, the idea was that there should be segregation between old and young, male and female, different categories of individual inmates. Some of these poor law union workhouses were immense. Ones like Fishpool in Bolton or the Preston Workhouse had over 1,500 inmates when they were full. And they were full at times. In Lancashire, key periods when the workhouses were overstretched were the early 1840s, when there was a trade depression, and famously, of course, during the cotton famine, 1861 to 1864. So in occasions like that, it was simply impossible to accommodate all of the people in the workhouse. And therefore, the guardians of the poor, the people who ran the system, had to continue the payment of out relief to people in their own homes, which undermined the system itself and was instrumental in gradually changing it, so that by the end of the 19th century, workhouses had rather come to resemble a combination of children's homes, old people's homes, and sick and hospital accommodation for the poor. But the system carried on until 1929. It was finally officially dissolved in 1929, but in fact, many aspects of it continued till 1948 and the setting up of the National Health Service. And as we mentioned, it's no accident at all that so many of our present day hospitals are either on the site of, or even in some cases still use, the workhouse accommodation that was built in the mid-19th century, because they evolution changed, as it were, from 1929 and 1948, they changed into National Health Service hospitals. We looked at the documentary records, admission books and registers, if you remember from last week, the punishment book at the Chorley Workhouse, with all its misdemeanors and offences committed by inmates. And very importantly, and I think something that's perhaps overlooked, the minute books of the Guardians of the Poor, which give a lot of detail about specific cases, specific individuals and their circumstances. So let's now have some questions. If anybody has anything that you want to ask, see if you can work the system. But there were two questions which we already had, which were sent in last week, and I'll answer those now. Forgive me, I've not noted down who asked them, so apologies for that, but I'll recite what the question was and then answer it. And the first question was, a specific one about the dietary that we looked at, the dietary sheets from the Burnley Workhouse, which referred to new milk and buttermilk. And the question was, what was the difference between them? And that's fairly simple and straightforward to answer. New milk is fresh milk, which of course in the 19th century would have been brought almost direct from the cow, hadn't been processed, hadn't been sterilized, hadn't gone through a sort of improvement system. So this was fresh milk. And we know that some workhouses actually kept their own cows for that purpose. But buttermilk was quite different. Buttermilk is what is the residue. It's what is left over, the liquid that's left over after the making of butter, or in some cases cheese. So it's milk which has had all the fat removed to give a sort of thin watery fluid, which was usually sour, because there was no refrigeration and because of the process of butter making. This was a thin milk which was soured naturally, not by artificial means, and was very widely regarded, and still is in parts of Europe, as a health drink. It was regarded as a very improving to the health, almost like a tonic. And so large quantities of buttermilk might be available, particularly in workhouses that kept their own cows. And the other question which was asked last week was a more general one. How were the diets within the workhouse in comparison to the diet that the poor might expect if they weren't in the workhouse? And of course, that's more difficult to answer in a very specific way. But in a general sense, the workhouse diet, although it was remarkably stodgy and very, very uninteresting, I mean, if you remember, it consisted largely of porridge, potatoes, sort of thin soups, that sort of thing. Although it was dull, and although by a modern nutritionist standard, it was not properly balanced, there weren't enough fresh vegetables, for example. In quantity, it was pretty hefty. It was not ungenerous in terms of keeping the poor from starving. They were generally, in a general sense, they were well fed. That, however, must be qualified, because the dietary sheets that we saw dated from the 1880s. And there's a lot of evidence, not just from Lancashire, but across the country as a whole, that when the system began, in that sort of period when it was supposed to be a deterrent, the dietaries that were available were far less adequate, far less satisfactory in terms of quantity as well as quality. And the notorious case in 1845, which highlighted this, was in Andover in Hampshire, the Andover Workhouse scandal. One of the tasks that was the able-bodied poor was set to was crushing bones for fertilizer at the Andover Workhouse. They were in a yard. They were given the task of bone crushing, and that was going to provide fertilizer. And an observer, a passerby almost, noted with horror that some of the pauper inmates of the workhouse were actually gnawing the bones themselves because they were starving. And this caused, quite rightly, a national scandal. So from the late 1840s, the dietary restrictions that were imposed by the Poor Law Commission in London were rapidly lifted in order to avert the possibility of more scandals of that sort. So we have evidence to show that in the early days of the poor law system, as it was after 1834, the diet was far less satisfactory. And it's also insignificant. It's important to note that a lot of the people who came to the workhouse right through the 19th century would have been absolutely destitute, and therefore their diets outside the workhouse would have been extremely inadequate. People were going to the workhouse who were in effect half starved, and the workhouse therefore rescued them from that circumstance. They became places of rescue for the destitute, and therefore the workhouse diet was, in that sense, much more satisfactory than the paupers would otherwise have expected. Now, has anyone got any questions? Oh, I am in Andover, scene of the great scandal. Any questions? I can't see any, so.
Yes,
Peter Bamford had his hand up first.
Well, I can't see the hands.
No, okay, I will do it. I was muted. Yeah, Peter Bamford was
right,
first.
Peter.
Alan, is it true that local workhouses weren't allowed to vary the diet which was laid down by the commissions in London? For instance, I've heard that in Grimsby, where there's a surfeit of fish, they weren't allowed to serve fish on the menu.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The basic principle that was operated after 1834 was that everything was controlled by and restricted by what basically were civil servants in London, and that this dietary sheet with only very slight variations would be the same right across the country in every poor law union, every workhouse. And that's absolutely true. And if you look at the minute books of some boards of guardians, they get circulars from London. Sometimes, I mean, I mentioned this, but every week or so there would be circulars, and these would be prescribing, for example, slight changes in the diet. You're allowed a pint and a half of gruel for breakfast for an able-bodied pauper instead of a pint and a quarter. So everything was, to use the modern term, micromanaged by London, which, needless to say, in counties like Lancashire and Yorkshire, met with huge opposition, not only because it was pedantic and pointless, but also because of the "we're not going to be told what to do by them down in London" attitude. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Grimsby case is very well known because, as the Grimsby Guardians asked, can we not have fish instead of meat on some days and things like that? No, you can't. It was a nonsensical system in that sense. And if the workhouse had a large amount of land, as some did, and they were growing vegetables, they weren't allowed to use those vegetables in the diet. They were supposed to sell them to offset the cost of the system.
Linda's next.
Yeah. Just thinking I think you've more or less said it implicitly in what you've been talking about, Alan, but thinking about, we refer sometimes to, social security now being like the workhouse test to see if people are eligible. Was there actually, I presume from what you've just said about the centralisation, there must have been a set quantifiable list that people had to meet to be accepted, presumably? Yes,
I mean, it was very closely prescribed, and there was in that there is a set of, or there was a set of assumptions. One of the most important of the assumptions is that the pauper who's looking to go to the workhouse, if there was either friends or relatives who could support him or her, then that was to be the priority, so that the deterrent element isn't only the workhouse regime itself, but it's a way of trying to limit the numbers who were even eligible to apply, because they were, they had a sister living or something like that who they would expect to look after them. So yes, I mean, it's means tested in that sense. It's also means tested if they have assets. This is particularly important with the sick and the elderly, who were not necessarily destitute, but were unable to fend for themselves, to look after themselves. And if they had assets, they were to be sold. And that's one of the elements involved in the, for example, the workhouse uniform. They weren't allowed to wear their own clothes, and their own clothes would be disposed of unless they were intending to leave the workhouse very shortly afterwards. So yes, in effect, it's means tested.
Thank you.
The next people with their hand up are Lynn and Keith Bennett, and then there's a question. Well, there are a couple of questions in the chat then.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Right. Lynn and Keith.
I just wanted to ask, in the period of around 1907, why might someone go into the workhouse and just only stay for about 21 days?
It depends who the person is. This is a specific instance, presumably.
Yes, yeah.
What were their circumstances? I mean,
well,
age and sex and things like that.
Well, I think he would have been in his 20s, between 20 and 30, that sort of age. He was married, I know that, and had children. I suspect he left his wife not long after that, but I wonder, he seemed to be with his wife at that time, as far as I know, but that was 1907. By 1911, he wasn't with her. So I just wondered why he might have been.
Yeah. That's often with a young person like that. It would be quite often the case that they were looking for work. If he was out of work,
right,
and they were therefore temporarily destitute,
right,
they might go into the workhouse, and then he would be given a sort of leave of absence to go and look for work, while the wife and children stayed in the workhouse. And that's
in the workhouse. The wife and children weren't in the workhouse.
They weren't.
No.
Well, that would be one option, which if they had been, that's a very common situation.
Right.
Another possibility is that he was sick in some way, needed what we would call hospital attention.
Right.
The basic principle there is that many of the hospitals that existed, I mean, by 1907, there were a lot of hospitals, of course, but they weren't necessarily free. And you weren't necessarily going to be able to get into them without a recommendation, whereas the workhouse would take people who were, without resources. And the workhouse infirmaries by 1907 were really, in general, were pretty good quality. So that's another possibility. The curiosity there is as I've said last week, young people in their 20s were probably the least likely to be in the workhouse, because of course they're the most likely to be working and able-bodied and without great problems. But poverty affects everyone, of course.
Thank you.
Can you see the questions in the chat, Alan, or do you want me to
I can
read
see the
them?
questions in the chat. I can see the chat from L&S.
Yeah.
I was born in a former workhouse, Townley's Hospital, Bolton, in 1946. My mother reported numerous cockroaches present while she was in labour. Dear, what modification occurred to workhouses to turn them into hospitals? The answer to that is that many of them had been increasingly modified over the previous, I mean, NHS is 1948, modified over the previous half century. Not in a particularly in a structural sense, but rather you perhaps remember the map, or the plan rather, of the Blackburn Workhouse with all its multiple different subsections as segregation was enforced. That gradually diminished in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and more of the workhouse would be turned over to infirmary or isolation purposes. And certainly in some workhouses, by the beginning of the 1920s, or ex-workhouses as they were not to be shortly, they were having, for example, labour wards for pregnant women and that sort of thing. So that the tendency was not to rebuild or basically sort of alter the structure particularly, but it was to redesignate parts of the workhouses for different purposes. And the numbers who were in the workhouses by the 1920s were diminishing significantly. Things like old age pensions and the beginnings of the welfare system were reducing the need for the sort of destitute workhouse role. They would also have, and this is something we notice in the 1880s onwards, but special vagrant wards where people, and men in particularly, could go to the workhouse just for overnight stays if they were tramps or vagrants. So you have sort of different purposes for different parts of the workhouse.
If you
now,
go to the last question, the latest question in the chat, that's also about the health situation. What was the situation mid-19th century? I'm looking at examples in Manchester, early 1860s, where it looks as though workhouse entry was driven specifically by ill health. Were they already serving as quasi-hospitals for those unable to pay by this time?
Yeah, that's very important, particularly the older people with ill health. I mean, when we looked last week at some of the notes I'd made from the Bolton Workhouse, it's very noticeable that the descriptions, albeit that they're very sort of generalized descriptions, but there's a very high proportion of people, excuse me, in the Bolton Workhouse in the 1860s, and Manchester would be the same, who were both elderly and also sick or feeble. Feeble perhaps meaning mentally feeble, but also meaning weak and frail. So that the role of the hospital, the role of the workhouse as a hospital, was certainly developing very rapidly in the 1860s. And that also links in with the role of the workhouse as a lying-in place for women about to give birth. It's a substitute for a hospital. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the proportion of women of single women, illegitimate births in workhouses was less than people might imagine. And there's work being done in the Penrith Union Workhouse about this issue, but that certain women relied heavily on the workhouse. So you find the evidence, for example, of women giving birth several times in the workhouse, as though certain groups of women, and basically it must be the particularly destitute pregnant women, were using the workhouse as a lying-in hospital. And you find, as I just suggested, the same sort of thing with elderly sick using the infirmary in the workhouse. And these are people, I mean, it depends on the individual cases and the individual place, but a lot of the hospitals tended to be short care hospitals rather than long-term sick hospitals, which the workhouse could be. I mean, that there are the infirmaries in places like Manchester and Liverpool, Bolton, tended to be expect people not to stay there for long periods, but just to go there and be treated and then leave again. So I think that the workhouse takes up the long-term sick catchment.
The next question is about industrial schools. What's the link between workhouses and industrial schools, and when did that come in and end?
Right, it's not an official link, but it's very closely related to the problem of children, particularly children with let me start again. Particularly children who are orphaned or whose parents have absconded. Children in the workhouse who are in the workhouse because it's an air of protection for them. And if you look at census returns, you often see that very clearly indicated, that industrial schools were used as a means of putting the child into a more specialized institution for the longer term. Workhouses, and come back to this point really, workhouses were increasingly used for long-term stay by the elderly and the sick, but they weren't really particularly well adapted to becoming long-stay children's homes. And so industrial schools and similar institutions were used quite widely as a way of it sounds unkind to say offloading, but in a sense that's the psychology of it, offloading children to a more specialized place of for the next few years of their life. came across, I've been editing an article by Lydia Gray on the Penrith Union Workhouse, which is where I've been finding some of the more recent interpretations. And in one case, she notes that a young girl was sent to from Penrith to an industrial school in Glasgow because her mother was basically becoming mentally unstable, and that sort of process is a very characteristic way of dealing with children in their sort of age 10, 11, that sort of age group.
The next question is, how were unmarried women and their illegitimate children treated in the workhouse?
Ah, well, that's exactly what Lydia Gray has been looking at the Penrith Union, which is pretty representative. There was a general assumption that unmarried women, destitute unmarried women, would go to the workhouse to give birth. And most workhouses, as I've already suggested, quite quickly became adapted with lying in wards for that purpose. What's very significant is that they very rarely stay longer than a few days, maybe a couple of weeks. So it is short stay entry into the workhouse. What is also obvious from the admission registers, if they survive, is that families, unmarried women with their children, plural, would go in order for her to give birth. The existing children would come with her. So you get small families going to the workhouse for short periods, and then maybe coming back again 18 months' time when the mother is again pregnant. So that it's a sort of short stay in and out arrangement. What we know very clearly from the evidence is that for the women who went to the workhouse to give birth, they were paradoxically perhaps the beneficiaries of better medical care than would be the case if they had been poor women outside the workhouse, because the workhouses from the beginning were required to have arrangements with, or indeed permanent resident doctors, and also many workhouses by the 1840s, 1850s and early 60s had nursing staff as well. So pregnant women giving birth to illegitimate children were often better provided for, both in terms of diet and their medical care, than poor women in the world outside. It's very significant that, excuse me, by the end of the century, sorry, not the end of the century, the 1870s and 1880s, it's very significant that we find the sort of identification of this process very widely across most poor law unions. And that was seen as one of the most important roles that the workhouse played.
Now, the next question is more about the bureaucracy of the poor law. To what extent did boards of guardians publish detailed written reports? In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Oxford City Board published annual reports that detailed all of their activities, including all awards of in and out relief. These named the recipients, dates and the sums paid out. Were such detailed published reports widespread?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, it becomes increasingly a matter of policy to do that, but you also find that the poor law boards of guardians were expected to keep meticulous records which were sent to central government. And if you look at the annual reports of the poor law commissioners, which sort of collates the evidence from all poor law unions, excuse me, you find a lot of statistical evidence. I have to say that I've not come across detailed published reports of the sort you described. for workhouses, although I have for county asylums, which in a sense were forming a sort of parallel group of institutions parallel to the workhouses. So I can't answer that from my own experience, because it's not something I've come across, but I do confirm that the annual reports of the Poor Law Commissioners are a very rich source, particularly if you want to do comparison between individual workhouses, because you get this sort of statistical tables in those. So that's not a very, sorry,
there's a very helpful addendum to that from the person who asked the question, that Oxfordshire Family History Society have published on CD these Oxford City Guardians of the Poor reports from 1875 to 1915.
right.
They're scanned images and they have a full name index. So that sounds a wonderful resource for Oxford.
Yeah, I mean, as early as 1875 is very early, I think. I mean, when I've been looking down the catalogues in Lancashire Archives for our poor law unions, I've certainly not come across any in the 19th century. On that note, I didn't say last week, but it's very important to think laterally when you're looking for workhouse records. Some of them will be this is the circumstance in Lancashire, at least, Lancashire Archives, but some of them appear under poor law unions. Some of them appear under local authority collections, and some of them appear under hospital records because of the transfer of documentation in 1948. So don't only look at poor law union, look very widely and put in the key, if you're searching online, put in a whole series of keywords like guardian or workhouse, rather than relying simply on one category of information.
And of course, ask at your local record office.
And ask at your local record office, to your friendly neighbourhood archivist.
Right.
Or in the case of Mrs. Crosby, I can ask her at dinner.
Right. There's another question. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, though. There's an idea that Oliver Twist was based on an incident at Liverpool Workhouse, and this is indicated in the characters' names. Brownlow, can you confirm?
Oh no, I can't. I'm afraid that I'm completely unable to answer that one. I'm trying to think what year Oliver Twist was published. It would be the 1850s, I think, wouldn't it? Early 1850s, probably. The Liverpool Brownlow Hill Workhouse, where the Catholic Cathedral now stands, was probably the largest in the country, and it was a legend. But it went back before 1834 because Liverpool had a major workhouse long before then. But I must be honest, I cannot say the answer to that, I'm afraid.
Now, there's no hands up at the moment and nothing else in the chat at the moment. Oh, Maureen's put her hand up.
Maureen,
would you like to unmute?
Can you unmute?
I can hear you, Maureen.
Are we unmuted?
We're unmuted.
Thank you, Alan. It's Peter.
You're not Maureen.
Thank
Go
you,
on, Peter.
It was picking up on the Guardian's question, actually. Just as I was listening, things were coming into my head. The election of Guardians, was there any change after 1894 as a result of the local government restructure? Was the sort of the voting rights as regards the election of Guardians extended? It's really sort of round the Guardians. Were people like Guardians benefactors within their own communities? Is there any evidence of that? And has any work been done on the social background of the Guardians? Compared to say Lytham, which was sort of manorial, sort of with the Cliftons dominant, to oppose the more sort of Freckleton, which was sort of a much more independent-minded community. It's just a general picture of Guardians and how they were elected. 1848, 94 and post 94?
They are a very interesting group of people because let us say being a poor law guardian was not a glamorous post. Unlike being a magistrate, for example, it gave no social status, no sort of particular social benefit. So the characteristics of the early poor law guardians, when I say early, I mean in the 1840s, 1850s, is that they tended to be middle class rather than upper middle class to higher even. They tended to be significant ratepayers. So what you find in, for example, in the filed Poor Law Union is that they're largely farmers, which is predictable. But you also find people in the professions, doctors, that sort of thing. And you also find in more urban areas that they tend to be retailers, shopkeepers, people of that sort. So it's one of the ways in which the system became, in a relative sense, more democratic. But also, very significantly, the eligibility for being a guardian was relatively low. So you know, there weren't the sort of restrictions that there were in being a magistrate. But the democratic franchise sort of overtook the parliamentary franchise, so that by the 1880s it was almost universal male suffrage. But you also find that women ratepayers were able to vote as guardian elections and in other areas of local government long before the parliamentary franchise. And I mentioned last week that in the late 1890s, you find the first women being elected as guardians. And this is really the area in which women are first able to actually stand for office and to become both eligible and also to be elected. You also find, and it was legendary in the East End of London, you find working men standing as guardians. And the legendary, the really sort of dramatic case was Poplar, where in the 1920s, the guardians were largely working class and simply refused to do what the government said, and, you know, prompted sort of outcries about this is subversion and revolution and that sort of thing. So you have a very sort of, in a general sense, very progressive type of thing by the late 19th centuries. One other area which is very interesting, and is not so much an elected office but an appointed office, is that many boards of guardians from a fairly early date appointed women as what they called visitors, as the sort of inspector team to look at the workhouse. Women were included, and the reason for that is that it was seen as inappropriate for male guardians to go and look at lying in wards and that sort of thing. So women were serving in a public role, even not an elected role, from the 1850s in many cases.
Thank you.
There's another question now, which sort of follows on from, you know, what sort of people the guardians were. To what extent were guardians local traders who took on the role to secure advantage for their businesses?
That's a very interesting question, because I've done some work on the filed union, and in the in the minute books there are lists of the contracts, and I think I showed that last week. I think this is the understory, the hidden story, because in big towns like Manchester, for example, that was probably not the case, because Manchester's, the sheer numbers, the sheer sort of complexity of running the Manchester Poor Law Union meant that there was a much greater element of professionalism and a lesser element of cozying. Whereas in the filed union, it does look sort of, to a suspicious mind like mine, that there was a very cozy relationship between some of the suppliers and the guardians themselves, because they were not exactly the same people necessarily, but they were certainly people who would have encountered each other in business and social life. So I think that the opportunities for, I mean, these are large institutions and contracts with a workhouse would be very good business indeed. And it's impossible to believe that everything in Victorian England was entirely above board and honourable and virtuous. So I think the cynical view is there's probably plenty of opportunity for discreet networking in that sort of way.
And the person who asked the question has added his own response. My ancestor was a publican who supplied the workhouse with ale, and he was a guardian.
I mean, they weren't supposed to drink ale, of course, except for medicinal purposes. But with all those sick people there, I expect it was still good business. I like that very much. Yes.
And a couple of people have actually been doing a bit of background research and can tell us that Oliver Twist was published as a serial between 1837 and 39.
Ah, right. Yes, it's earlier because Dickens was born in 1812, so it's one of his early works. The great Liverpool workhouse, the one that was eventually pulled down to make the site of the Catholic Cathedral, was rather later than that, I think, in its full glory. But this very large town workhouse pre-existed, so that would be perfectly possible.
Now, I don't think we've got anything else at the moment.
There's no new questions come up.
And no hands up.
Right. Well, we've taken 45 minutes, which was more or less what we said we would have, I think, haven't we?
Yeah.
So if there aren't any more questions.
I suppose the only other thing to tell people is that we've put edited versions of the first two sessions on the Friends of Lancashire Archives website. They're YouTube videos, but they've been embedded in the website. And what I'll do later today is to send everybody a link, everybody who's signed up for these sessions, a link so that you can look at it if you want, or pass it on. It is freely available on the Friends website.
And don't forget that this was sponsored by the Friends of Lancashire Archives, and you should all join it if you're not a member already.
Now, there is another question.
Oh, another question.
Yes, from Dorothy in Cheshire. So if you would like to unmute Dorothy and ask your question.
Yes, has that unmuted it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I just want to ask, is an overseer of the poor the same thing as a guardian?
No. Overseers of the poor go back to the 16th century. It would now be called a destitute persons operative or some other fancy title, but they were very direct in the 16th century. The earliest overseers, or sorry, the earliest legislation that refers to overseers was passed in 1572, so it's a much older system. It basically in the north of England, every township, in the south and the Midlands, every parish had to appoint an overseer who served a 1-year term of office, received no pay, had no training or anything like that. But his job was to, as the title suggests, his job was to basically to manage the poor and to deal with the money that was involved in the poor rate. So every township and every parish would have an overseer from the late 16th century onwards. and they carried on after 1834 because the parish had the task of raising the money. But from the 1834 legislation onwards, their role was drastically reduced and then was abolished. So it's not the same as a guardian.
Oh, right, thank you. It's just that my husband's ancestor and great-great-grandfather in the 1800s in Preston is on the censuses, probably 1871, 81, as an overseer of the poor.
Yeah.
I just wondered what he would be doing, really.
Yeah, he works in conjunction with the poor law guardians, and he's responsible for managing the business in Preston, but the guardians cover the whole of the Preston Poor Law Union, which is much larger than the town.
Yes.
And sorry, go on.
Sorry, I'm just an overseer of the poor would have nothing to do with the workhouses then?
Not directly, no. He's mainly concerned with the financial aspects of it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and another thing, I'm just looking at your remark about the workhouses finishing in 1829. When I was a child,
1929.
1929.
Yeah.
When I was a child and growing up in the late 40s and 50s, one of the frequent expressions my mother was constantly saying was, "You'll have me in the workhouse."
That's right.
And I think she was referring mostly to my sister, who was constantly needing new shoes. She was constantly wearing them out. So really thinking about saying, "You'll have me in the workhouse," there wouldn't be a workhouse, would there? And it was probably a remark that she'd maybe heard herself as a child or something.
It's folk memory. I mean, they were abolished. Well, let me say, not abolished. They were renamed in 1929.
Yeah.
But it's deeply embedded in people's popular memory. You know, my grandma in the 1960s would say it as well. So, and she was, but you know, anybody born. Well, I don't know. Let's say if you were born in the early 1920s, you know the workhouse as, I mean, not know the workhouse necessarily from personal experience, but the workhouses were still there during the 1920s. So
yes, right. Thank you. Yeah.
There's another question in the chat. If the guardians were seen to be too radical, were they kicked off?
They couldn't, if they'd been elected democratically, no, they couldn't be kicked off, but they were subject to intense pressure, particularly in Lancashire and Yorkshire in the 1850s, 1860s, when they were refusing to undertake the building of workhouses. They, as far as I know, in those two counties in that period, none of the boards of guardians were actually suspended. But the government cajoled and threatened on a grand scale. In the end, all the boards of guardians did concede. So if you remember, the last lot to give in to the government were the Todmorden guardians in 1879. But the pressure they were under was intense, and there was always the threat that they could dissolve the Poor Law Union. What happens in the 1920s in Poplar is that the government does, I believe, actually suspend the guardians, but they couldn't be kicked off because they'd been directly elected, unlike magistrates, for example, who, if they blotted the copybooks, could actually be forced to resign. Yes. L&S, I have found mid-19th century comprehensive newspaper advertisements for the supply of the Ulverston workhouse, including somewhat chillingly shrouds. Yes, I think that's very, very characteristic. And we've got some other comments. Guardians seem to have progressed to being guardians after being first church wardens in their respective rural parishes. I wonder if that was a standard route. I think it was not standard route as such, but it was simply that the catchment in rural parishes for people of social and economic standing was relatively small. So people inevitably did perhaps more than one public office or went from one to another. But certainly in rural poor law unions in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, what you find is, because they normally name the occupation of the person and you can check it in the census, but farmers are absolutely characteristic of that. And of course, they serve as church wardens as well. Have we got any other comments? John Dalton, I was born in Oldham Workhouse in 1950 and our eldest daughter was born in Blackburn Workhouse in 1980. Yes, that's you hear stories about people who won't go to a particular hospital because it was the workhouse, and the stigma was still attached to the building even if it had long since ceased to be a workhouse as such.
Well, I'm very grateful to Paul, who told me how to save the chat. So I have saved the chat, and yeah, we'll put that available somewhere as well. And I think that's probably about it for questions. So thank you, Alan, and thank you all very much for taking part, for listening to the first two sessions, and for asking such interesting questions today.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Alan.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's leave.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye, Zilpha.